The morning Mary Rhodes counted 147 tomato seeds into her palm and realized she did not have enough soil to plant even a quarter of them, was the same morning Theodore Sullivan rode his black stallion down the long dirt road that cut through Calhoun County, Texas, and changed everything she thought she knew about the rest of her life. It was the spring of 1878, and the land around Harlow Creek was the kind of beautiful that punished you for noticing it. The bluebonnets had pushed up through the cracked red earth along the fence line, purple and defiant, and the sky stretched overhead in that particular shade of cloudless blue that made a person feel both enormous and small at the same time. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed were putting out their first tender leaves, pale and trembling in the warm breeze that came rolling in from the south, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a meadowlark was making a sound so pure and clean it almost hurt. Mary sat on the porch of her farmhouse with a clay bowl in her lap and a small cloth spread across her knees to catch any seeds that might roll away. She had been saving these seeds since the previous autumn, drying them in the window of the kitchen and storing them in paper envelopes that she labeled in her careful, neat hand. Tomatoes, squash, Kentucky Wonder beans, Cherokee purple. She had plans for the garden this year, big plans, the kind of plans a woman makes when she is trying to give herself reasons to keep going. Her husband, Daniel Rhodes, had been dead for 11 months. He had died of a fever that came on fast and mean in the June heat, and he had been gone within a week of the first symptoms. There had been no time to prepare, no time to say everything that needed saying, no time to do anything except hold his hand and watch the light go out of his eyes while Dr. Cummings stood in the corner of the bedroom looking at the floor. Daniel had been 34 years old. Mary was 31. The farm they had built together was 50 acres of good bottomland and a promise. Daniel had known cattle and horses, and Mary had known gardens and preservation, and together they had made something that worked. Now it was just Mary and the 50 acres and the promise felt heavier every single day. She had a hired hand named Pete Garza who came by 3 times a week to tend the cattle and fix fences, but she could only afford to pay him a small wage, and she knew he had other work with larger operations nearby. She had her neighbor, Edna Holloway, who lived 2 miles down the road and who brought food sometimes and asked intrusive questions always. And she had her work, which was the only thing that kept the dark thoughts from settling in for good. Mary was counting the last envelope of seeds when she heard the hoofbeats. She looked up from her bowl and squinted down the long dirt road that led to the main road, and she saw a rider coming at an easy, unhurried pace. The horse was black and large and immaculately groomed, the kind of animal that cost more money than most men in Calhoun County earned in a year. The rider sat straight in the saddle with the effortless authority of a man who had been riding since before he could walk. He wore a dark hat and a good coat, and even from a distance, there was something about the way he carried himself that made Mary set down her bowl. Theodore Sullivan was 41 years old and owned more land in Calhoun County than any other single person, living or dead. His ranch, the Double S, sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime Texas rangeland, and he ran close to 3,000 head of cattle on it. He had a house that was more properly called a mansion by any fair standard, with 2 floors and a wraparound porch and glass windows that caught the light in the mornings. He employed 23 men full-time and brought on seasonal workers for the drives. He had been written about in the San Antonio paper twice, neither time for anything scandalous, which was itself a remarkable achievement for a man of his wealth and position in that era. He was also, by most accounts, a solitary and serious man who kept his own counsel and did not socialize much beyond what business required. He had never married, which was a source of considerable speculation in town and considerable frustration for the mothers of eligible daughters throughout the county. It was not that Theodore Sullivan was cold, exactly. It was more that he seemed to be waiting for something he had not yet found, and the waiting had made him quiet. Mary knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. She had seen him at the general store and at the church socials, and once at a cattle auction where she had gone with Daniel to sell 2 steers. She knew him by reputation and by sight, but she had never spoken more than 3 words to the man. He rode up to her fence line and stopped, and he swung down from the black horse with the smooth, practiced motion of a man half his age. He tied the reins to the fence post with one hand and removed his hat with the other, and he looked at Mary sitting on her porch with her bowl of seeds in her lap, and he said, "Mrs. Rhodes, I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Theodore Sullivan, and I have something to propose to you." Mary looked at him for a long moment. The meadowlark had gone quiet. The bluebonnets were very still. She said, "Mr. Sullivan, I know who you are. You are welcome to come up to the porch if you would like to say whatever you have come to say." He opened the gate in the fence and walked up the path, and he was taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that was threaded through with gray at the temples, and a face that had been shaped by weather and time into something that was not exactly handsome in a conventional way, but was deeply, unmistakably compelling. His eyes were the color of good river water, a kind of blue-gray that shifted when the light moved. He came up onto the porch and she gestured to the chair across from hers, and he sat down and held his hat in both hands and looked at her with those river water eyes, and she thought, somewhat involuntarily, that she had never had a man look at her quite that carefully before, as though he was actually seeing her rather than the image of a widow that people tended to project onto her these days. "I will be direct with you," Theodore said. "I appreciate your time, and I do not want to waste it." "I appreciate that," Mary said. He took a breath. "I have been aware of your situation since Daniel passed last summer. I know that this farm is 50 acres, and that you have been managing it largely on your own with Pete Garza helping part-time. I know that the south pasture fence has needed replacing for 2 seasons, and that the well has been giving trouble, and that you lost 2 calves this past winter to the cold." Mary felt her jaw tighten slightly. She did not like being observed without her knowledge, even if the observation was accurate. "You seem to know a great deal about my farm, Mr. Sullivan." "I pay attention to the land in this county," he said simply, not defensively. "It is my business to know what is happening to the farms around me. And I want you to understand that what I am about to say comes from a place of genuine respect and not from any intention to take advantage of your circumstances." She set the bowl of seeds on the porch railing and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I have been looking," Theodore said, "at expanding my operation for some time. The bottomland along your southern fence line is some of the finest soil in the county. The access to the creek is valuable, and your location on the road makes it a strategic piece for the overall management of the double S." He paused. "I would like to buy your farm, Mrs. Rhodes. I am prepared to offer you fair market value, and by fair I mean genuine fair, not the figure some men in this county would call fair. I would pay you enough that you could resettle somewhere comfortable and never have to worry about money again." Mary looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek and made a sound like water. A crow called from the fence post at the edge of the property. "Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, "I built this farm with my husband. We broke the soil and dug the well and put up those fences and planted those trees." She gestured toward the 2 young peach trees Daniel had put in the year before he died, staked and still growing, barely taller than the fence. "I am not interested in selling." Theodore nodded as though he had expected this answer. He turned the hat in his hands. He looked out at the property, at the modest but well-kept house, at the garden beds visible at the side, at the cattle grazing in the far pasture. Then he looked back at her. "I understand," he said, "and I respect that." There was a pause, and then Mary, because she was a woman who had been raised to be hospitable regardless of her feelings, said, "Can I offer you some water or coffee before you ride back?" "Coffee would be kind," he said. She went inside and put the pot on, and while she waited for it to boil she stood at the kitchen window and watched him through the glass. He had stood up from the chair and walked to the porch railing and was looking out at her land with an expression she could not entirely read from this distance. He was not the kind of man who fidgeted or paced or showed his hand easily. He stood very still, as though the stillness was something he had practiced. She brought the coffee out in 2 cups, and they sat in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected to feel anger, or at least something sharp and defensive after his proposal to buy her out, but the anger had not really materialized. He had been honest about what he wanted and honest about why he wanted it, and in her experience that was rarer than it should have been. "How long have you had the double S?" she asked. 17 years, he said. "I came out from Virginia in '61, started with 400 acres and a herd of 80 cattle and built up from there." "Your family did not come with you. My parents were both gone by then. I had a brother in Richmond who stayed." He looked at his cup. "He died in the war." "I am sorry," Mary said. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was what people said when something was not really a long time ago at all. They drank their coffee and looked at the land together, and eventually Theodore Sullivan stood up and put his hat back on and said that he was grateful for her time and her hospitality, and that he hoped she would reconsider his offer if she found the farm becoming too much to manage alone. Mary told him she would keep it in mind, which was what she said when she intended to do no such thing. He rode away down the dirt road, and she watched him go, and then she picked up her bowl of seeds and went back to counting. She thought about him more than she expected to over the following days. She thought about the way he had listened to her, really listened, when she said she was not interested in selling. There had been no argument, no pressure, no attempt to convince her that she was being foolish or sentimental or impractical. He had simply accepted her answer with a kind of quiet dignity that she found, she admitted to herself, rather striking. Most men in Calhoun County in 1878 would have had a great deal more to say about the decision of a widow to hold onto 50 acres of land against the offer of the richest man in the county. 2 weeks after Theodore's visit, Pete Garza came to her in the morning with his hat in his hands and told her that the Johnson family, who ran the big cattle operation north of town, had offered him steady work and he could not afford to turn it down. He was sorry, he said, and he meant it. Mary thanked him for his months of service and paid him what she owed him, and then she stood in the yard after he rode off and looked at the pasture full of cattle and the fence that still needed mending and the south field that needed turning, and she felt the particular and very specific weight of being alone settle down onto her shoulders like a heavy coat. She could hire someone else, of course. But hiring cost money, and money was not something she had in abundance. Daniel had left her the farm and a modest amount of savings, and she had been careful, but careful had its limits. The winter had been harder than expected, and the price of cattle was not what it had been the previous year, and the garden was not yet productive enough to supplement what the cattle brought in. She spent 3 days turning the south field herself with a hand plow, working until her palms blistered, and her back ached in a way that made it hard to sleep. On the 4th day, she went into town to buy seed from Henderson's general store, and she ran into Edna Holloway, who ran into everyone eventually because Edna Holloway was fundamentally incapable of going to the store without encountering people she knew and having long conversations with all of them. "I heard Theodore Sullivan came out to your place," Edna said, in the tone of someone who had heard this recently, thoroughly, and from multiple sources. "He made an offer to buy the farm," Mary said, measuring out her words carefully. "And you said no." Edna's expression was a complex mixture of admiration and disbelief. "I said no." "Mary Rhodes," Edna said. "Theodore Sullivan has been trying to buy land in this county for 3 years. Everyone he approaches says yes. He pays very good money." "It is not about the money," Mary said. "I know it is not," Edna said more gently, and she touched Mary's arm in that way she had, the touch that meant she understood something without needing it spelled out. "Daniel loved that land." "We both did," Mary said. She bought her seeds and went home, And that night she sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the creek and thought about what it would take to make it through another year. The numbers were not encouraging. She was good at numbers, had always been, and the numbers said that without help she would be selling cattle below value by autumn just to stay solvent. She was still sitting in the dark when she heard a horse on the road, and her heart did something unexpected when she recognized the shape of the black stallion in the moonlight. Theodore Sullivan stopped at the fence and called out, "Mrs. Rhodes, I apologize for the late hour. I saw your light and wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine," she said. "I was just sitting." A pause. Then he said, "Would you object to company for a few minutes?" She considered this for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Come up," she said. He tied the horse and walked up the path, and in the moonlight his face was all shadow and angle, and she suddenly felt very aware of how quiet the night was and how far away the nearest neighbor was. But she did not feel afraid. That surprised her too. He sat in the same chair he had sat in on his first visit, and she brought out the oil lamp from inside because the night was dark, and they sat in the warm yellow circle of lamplight with the stars overhead. "I was riding the fence line on the north pasture," he said, "checking on some new cattle we brought in last week. Came out later than I expected." "New cattle?" she asked. And somehow this was what opened the door between them. He talked about the cattle with a kind of honest enthusiasm that she recognized, because it was the same enthusiasm she had when she talked about her garden, the same careful love for living things that needed tending. He knew each pasture by its grass and its drainage. He knew which water source ran cold in summer and which one mudded in the spring rains. He talked about the land the way a man talks about something he genuinely cares for, and Mary found herself leaning forward slightly in her chair without meaning to. She told him about the seeds she had been counting the day he came. She told him about the Cherokee purple tomatoes she had grown from seeds her mother gave her, and about the Kentucky wonder beans that climbed the fence posts every summer, and about the squash that Daniel had always eaten straight from the vine while she was still trying to cook it. She had not talked about Daniel casually, easily like this, since he died. It came out of her without the usual weight. Theodore listened. Not politely, not with the distant sympathy people offered at funerals and for months afterward. He listened the way he had looked at her that first day, as though he was actually there, actually paying attention. They talked until the oil in the lamp burned low, and then he stood and said he had kept her up far too late and he was sorry for it. But he did not look sorry exactly. He looked like a man who had found something unexpected and was being careful about it. "I enjoyed the conversation," Mary said honestly. "As did I," he said. He put his hat on and paused at the top of the porch steps. "Mrs. Rhodes, I hope you know that my offer to buy your farm was not a personal slight. I have great respect for what you have built here. I know that," she said, "and I hope you know that my refusal was not personal either." He smiled at that, and it changed his face entirely. It was not the polished smile of a wealthy man accustomed to getting his way. It was something more private, a little uncertain, and it made him look younger. "Good night, Mary," he said, and then seemed to catch himself using her first name, and she saw the slight tension across his jaw. "Good night, Theodore," she said, and let him know by her tone that the use of first names was perfectly acceptable. He rode away into the dark, and Mary sat for a while longer in the night air, and she thought about what it felt like to have a real conversation again, the kind where both people were actually present, and she thought that she had missed that more than she had let herself know. In the weeks that followed, Theodore Sullivan found reasons to pass by Mary Rhodes's farm with a regularity that would have been conspicuous to anyone paying attention, and in a county this size, several people were paying attention. He brought her a load of split firewood one morning, arriving before she was properly awake with two of his hands and a wagon full of good oak. He left before she could argue about it, though she could see from the kitchen window that he had directed the placement of every single piece with care. She went to his fence line 3 days later with a jar of preserved peaches and told him that the firewood was much appreciated but that she would not be accepting charity. He looked at the jar of peaches and then at her face, and he said, "It is not charity. Consider it a neighborly gesture between people who share a county." "Then I expect you accept neighborly gestures in return," she said, holding out the jar. He took it with both hands as carefully as if it were something fragile. "Gladly," he said. This was how it began, in the frank and practical language of exchange, in the honest currency of a jar of peaches and a wagon load of oak. Mary was not a woman given to foolishness or sentiment, and Theodore Sullivan was not a man who said things he did not mean, and so what grew between them grew slowly, and with the kind of solidity that comes from things built carefully rather than quickly. He came to help when the south pasture fence finally gave way completely, arriving on a Saturday morning with 2 hands and enough new fence posts and wire to redo the whole line. He worked alongside his men in shirt sleeves, without any of the distance of a boss, and Mary brought water out and watched him from the porch and felt something warm and complicated moving around in her chest. She invited him to stay for supper when the work was done, and he sent his hands back with the wagon and stayed, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked until the stars came out, and then they walked out to the porch and looked at the sky together, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling night air. "Tell me about Virginia," she said. "What was it like before you came out here?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "Green," he said finally. "Everything was very green, different from here. Softer, maybe, but I always felt like the land here suits me better. There is something honest about this country. It does not pretend to be more than it is." "No," she said, "it does not." "Where did you come from?" he asked. "Before Texas." "Missouri," she said. "My father had a farm near Springfield. Daniel and I came out in '69. We were young and we thought we were invincible the way young people do." "Were you happy here?" he asked. "Before." "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest and most complete answer she had given to any question since Daniel died. "We were very happy." "I am glad for that," Theodore said, "for what it is worth." She looked at his profile against the dark sky, the strong jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth, and she thought that it was worth quite a lot, actually, to hear someone say that simply and mean it. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Clement Doyle, and it arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning in the middle of May. Clement Doyle was the owner of the Doyle Livestock and Land Company out of San Marcos, and he had been buying up property throughout the county for the past year, with a persistence that had made several families move on faster than they had intended. He was a short, compact man with pale eyes and the kind of smile that worked very hard at appearing friendly while giving nothing of real warmth. He rode up to Mary's farm with 2 men behind him and introduced himself with great courtesy, and then he offered her a price for her land that was 20% below what Theodore had offered. Mary looked at the price he had written on the paper, and then at the man, and then at his 2 companions, who were very large and very quiet. "This is not a fair price, Mr. Doyle," she said. "It is the going rate for land of this quality in this area," he said smoothly. "Mr. Sullivan offered me considerably more," she said. Something moved through Clement Doyle's pale eyes. It was not pleasant. "Sullivan's offer was not genuine," he said. "He has been buying up land in this county for years, Mrs. Rhodes, and he does not pay what he promises. There are families who have learned that lesson at significant cost." This was a lie. Mary knew it was a lie because she had talked to 3 families who had sold to Theodore Sullivan, and all 3 had spoken of him as fair to the point of generosity. But she kept her face still and said, "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Doyle, and I will give it consideration." He left his card and rode away, and the 2 quiet men rode with him, and Mary stood at the fence and watched them go with her arms folded across her chest, and a cold feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. That evening Theodore came by, as he had taken to doing 2 or 3 evenings a week, and Mary told him about Doyle's visit. She watched Theodore's expression carefully while she spoke, and what she saw there was not the anger she expected, but something more measured and more serious. Clement Doyle has been pushing into this county for 18 months, Theodore said. He bought the Hendricks farm and the Alvarez place under circumstances that I have been trying to document. He uses pressure. He paused. I want to be honest with you about something. I knew he was coming to the smaller farms along this road. That is part of why I came to you in the spring. I wanted to buy your farm before he could get to it. Mary felt a small, sharp thing move through her. You were not telling me the whole truth when you came. I was not telling you all of it, he admitted. My offer was genuine and at fair value, and I do mean that. But yes, part of my motivation was to keep Doyle from getting his hands on this particular piece of bottomland. He would drain the creek rights and sell the cattle off and leave the land stripped. He looked at her steadily. I should have been fully transparent about that from the beginning. I am sorry that I was not. Mary looked at him for a long moment. She was not, she realized, as angry as she might have expected to be. He had told her the truth when given the opportunity, even though the truth was not entirely flattering to him, and that counted for something. And now, she asked, what is your interest now? A pause stretched between them, long and weighted, full of all the evenings on the porch and the conversations that had gone on too late, and the way he had looked at her in the lamplight. Theodore Sullivan, who was not a man who said things he did not mean, took a breath. Considerably more personal, he said quietly. Mary looked at the creek in the distance, at the last of the evening light on the water. Her heart was doing something she had told it very firmly not to do. That is a complicated thing to say, she said. I know it is, he said. I do not say it lightly. She did not respond right away, and he did not push her, and they sat in the remaining light until it was fully dark. And then he went home, and Mary sat alone with her thoughts for a long time. She thought about Daniel, who had been her first love and her companion for 12 years, who had been kind and steady and good. She thought about what it meant to love someone again after losing someone. She thought about whether it was possible for a heart to be loyal and still be open at the same time. She thought about the way Theodore had looked when he told her his brother had died in the war, the careful way he had contained that grief. She thought about peaches and firewood and fence posts and the particular color of river water eyes. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning she got up early and went out to the garden and put seeds in the ground, Cherokee purples and Kentucky wonders and the squash that Daniel had always eaten too early, and she thought that planting seeds was itself an act of faith. You put something in the dark earth and you trusted the process, trusted the warmth and the water and the time, and you waited. You did not always know exactly what was going to come up. But you planted anyway, because the alternative was an empty garden and a harder winter. Clement Doyle came back on a Thursday, without his companions this time, but with a new document and a harder tone beneath the surface politeness. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her that the value of her property was declining, and that she would do better to sell now than to wait for the market to drop further. Mary folded her hands on the table and looked at him with a steadiness that came from something deeper than composure. Mr. Doyle, she said, I know for certain that land values in this area have not declined, because my neighbor 2 miles west sold her property last month for a price that suggests the market is quite healthy. And I know that you have said disparaging things about Mr. Sullivan's character to at least 3 people in this county, all of whom have told me those things were not true in their experience, so I am going to ask you plainly not to come to my property again. Clement Doyle's smile went away entirely. Mrs. Rhodes, he said, you are a widow woman managing a property alone. These things have a way of becoming very difficult without support. It was not quite a threat. It was the kind of sentence that could be interpreted as concern if it needed to be, but that both people at the table understood was not concern at all. Good morning, Mr. Doyle, Mary said, and stood. He left, and this time there was no card and no courtesy, and the sound of his horse on the road was angry. Mary went to the bedroom and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and let herself feel the fear that she had not let show at the table. Then she straightened up and went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. because she was going to think this through clearly, and she thought better with tea. She did not want to go to Theodore, not because she was too proud, but because she wanted to be sure she was going to him for the right reasons and not because she was frightened. She did not want fear to make her decisions. She had seen women make decisions out of fear, and she understood how those stories tended to end. She thought it through carefully over the course of the afternoon, working in the garden while she thought, pulling weeds and checking the new seedlings. By the time the evening came and she heard the familiar sound of Theodore's horse on the road, she had arrived at clarity. She told him what Doyle had said, and she watched the muscles in Theodore's jaw go hard. "That is an implied threat," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know it is." "I want to go to the sheriff," he said. "I have been building a file on Doyle for months, affidavits from the Hendricks family and others about the way he operated. This is another thing to add." "Good," Mary said. "Do that." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as though he had expected more resistance. "You are not going to tell me you can handle this yourself." "I can handle a great deal myself," she said. "I have been doing so for 11 months, but handling something yourself and refusing help when help is good and right are not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mary." Just her name, the way he had said it that first night by accident and caught himself. But now it was deliberate, and it held something in it that made the night feel very still. "Theodore," she said. "I need to say something," he said. "And I need to say it plainly because I have been saying things sideways for too long, and that is not fair to you." She waited. The creek murmured in the distance. The stars were coming out. "I would very much like to court you," he said. "Properly, with the full understanding that I am asking you something significant and that you owe me no particular answer. You are the most capable and honest and frankly remarkable woman I have met in my life. And I have been trying to find a reason to come to this porch since the day I first rode up the road and saw you sitting there with your seeds." Mary felt the warmth move through her like the first real heat of a Texas summer, and she thought about the garden and the seeds and the act of faith required to put something in the dark earth. "I would like that," she said, "with the same understanding that I am saying something significant in return, and that I am saying it carefully and with full intention." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding his breath. This man, who ran 12,000 acres and 3,000 cattle and 23 employees, had been holding his breath waiting for her answer. And the vulnerability in that was the thing that finally, completely, and without reservation, opened the rest of her heart. They sat together on the porch until the hour grew late, not much different from all the evenings before, except that everything was different. The space between their chairs felt different. The air felt different. The stars were the same stars, but they seemed to be doing something more deliberate with the light. When Theodore stood to leave, he paused at the steps and turned and held out his hand. She gave him hers, and he held it with both of his and looked at her in the lamplight with those river water eyes and said, "Good night, Mary Rhodes." "Good night, Theodore Sullivan," she said. He rode home in the dark, and Mary stood at the edge of the porch and watched him go, and she felt the particular and very specific sensation of something coming back to life after a long winter. The situation with Clement Doyle escalated before it resolved, as these things tend to do. Theodore went to Sheriff Beaumont Hale with the affidavits he had been collecting, and the sheriff, who was an honest man in a county that had seen its share of dishonest ones, took the complaint seriously. He sent a deputy out to look into Doyle's land acquisitions, and what the deputy found in the county records was not reassuring. 3 of the transactions involved sale prices that did not match the prices in the original offer, letters that the sellers had kept, suggesting the final documents had been altered. 2 of the sellers had not understood they were signing away mineral rights along with the surface rights. One elderly widow had signed a document she had been told was a lease agreement that was in fact a deed transfer. It was not an uncommon story in the West of 1878, where land records were imperfect and legal representation was scarce, and men with money and lawyers could take advantage of people who had neither. The injustice of it was real and it was not new, and Mary felt it with the particular sharpness of someone who understood exactly how close she herself had come to that situation. Theodore was the one who found a lawyer. He brought him out from San Antonio on the stage, a young man named Everett Cole who was sharp and thorough, and who spent 2 days going through every document Doyle had touched in the county. By the end of the second day, Everett Cole had identified grounds for legal challenge to 4 of Doyle's acquisitions. Clement Doyle, when confronted by Sheriff Hale with the evidence and the lawyer and the specific nature of the charges being considered, made the decision that men like him generally make when the ground shifts under their feet. He sold his Calhoun County holdings at a substantial loss, settled privately with 2 of the families he had defrauded, and relocated his operation to another county to the north, where presumably he intended to do the same thing to different people. Mary heard about his departure from Edna Holloway, who heard about everything eventually, and felt a cold satisfaction at the news that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but was somewhere in the honest territory between them. The Hendricks family got part of their money back. The elderly widow, Mrs. Carver, had the deed transfer to her property reversed and returned home from her daughter's house in Houston with a dignity she had been trying to maintain since the whole business began. It was not a perfect resolution because these things rarely are, but it was more justice than most had expected, and in Calhoun County in 1878 that was worth something. Mary thanked Theodore for what he had done, and he said that Everett Cole had done the real work. And Everett Cole, when she said the same thing to him, said that Theodore Sullivan had paid for 6 weeks of his time and every cent of the settlement money for Mrs. Carver, and had done it without wanting credit or acknowledgement, which told Mary a great deal about the man she had already suspected she was falling in love with. Summer came to Harlow Creek with its full force and without apology, the kind of Texas summer that makes you understand why people talk about heat the way they talk about a personal enemy. The days were long and ferocious, and the nights were warm and full of sound, the crickets and the frogs from the creek bottom and the wind in the tall grass. Mary's garden was flourishing in a way that was almost extravagant, the Cherokee purples hanging heavy and dark red on the vines, the Kentucky wonders running up the fence posts in green cascades, the squash spreading its broad leaves across the ground in a display that would have made Daniel eat them straight from the vine with great enthusiasm. She brought Theodore tomatoes on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, walking the 2 miles to the Double S with a basket on her arm and her heart in a state that she refused to describe as nervous, though it was clearly nervous. The Double S was everything its reputation promised. The house was impressive but not cold, a house where someone lived and worked and thought rather than a monument to wealth. There was a proper kitchen garden on the south side that was somewhat neglected, and Mary noted this with the professional eye of someone who understood gardens. There was a large barn and a bunkhouse and corrals, and hands moving around the property with the purposeful ease of people who knew their work well. Theodore met her at the gate with an expression that suggested he was as surprised as he was pleased, and she held up the basket and said, "Cherokee purples." "Come in," he said, with a warmth in his voice that she had been thinking about since the last time she heard it. He showed her around the property with the same openness he brought to everything, pointing out the creek access and the irrigation channels he had built and the pastures where different herds grazed. She asked questions and he answered them, and she told him about what was working in her own operation and what was not, and he listened with his full attention, the way he always did. They ended up in the kitchen, which was a large, practical room with a cast iron stove and a long work table, where a woman named Rosa who cooked for the ranch hands was making bread with her sleeves rolled up and an expression of benign indifference to the presence of visitors. Theodore made coffee without ceremony, comfortable in his own kitchen, and they sat at the work table with the tomatoes between them and talked for most of the afternoon. Mary looked at the kitchen garden through the window and said, "Your south garden needs attention." "I know it does," he said. "I have not had anyone who knows gardens since the woman who managed the household moved away 3 years ago." "I could look at it," she offered. He looked at her with those river water eyes, and she thought she saw something careful happen in them, something that was weighing the offer and understanding that it was more than it said. "I would be very grateful for that," he said. She went out to the kitchen garden and walked the beds and assessed the damage with the calm practicality of a woman who had been growing things in Texas for 9 years. The soil was compacted and the beds needed turning. Some of the plants were leggy from no pruning. There were weeds that had been allowed to get established. But the bones were good, the drainage was right, and the soil itself was rich. She told him all of this in plain terms, and he listened. And she thought that this was one of the things she liked best about him, that he listened to what she knew without any impulse to correct or diminish it simply because she was a woman. She started coming to the Double S twice a week to work the kitchen garden, and he started coming to her farm twice a week to help with whatever was heaviest, and the distance between their respective properties began to feel less like a boundary and more like a short trip that both of them were making willingly. Edna Holloway, encountering Mary at Henderson's General Store in August, looked at her with the attentive expression of a woman who had been cataloging the evidence. "You look different," Edna said. "I look the same," Mary said. "You look the way you looked before Daniel got sick," Edna said. "You look like yourself again." Mary put her flour into her basket and did not say anything, but she was smiling, and she did not bother hiding it. On an evening in late August, sitting on the porch of the Double S after supper while the sun went down in spectacular fashion behind the western ridge, Theodore turned to Mary with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was a kind of careful vulnerability, and it was more moving than she expected on a face she had come to associate with steadiness and calm. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about why I never married." "You do not have to," she said. "I want to," he said. "Because I want you to understand that my asking to court you is not a light thing for me. I was engaged once, in '63 before I came to Texas. Her name was Catherine." He was looking at the ridge. "She died of typhoid fever 2 weeks before the wedding. I was 26 years old." Mary felt the weight of that, the particular grief of a loss that precise, that close to the beginning of a life together. "I am deeply sorry," she said. "After that I threw myself into the land," he said. "For 15 years I built this ranch and I told myself it was enough, and it was enough in a functional sense. I was not miserable, but I was," he paused, searching for the word, "incomplete." "Yes," Mary said, because she knew exactly what that word meant in this context. "And then I rode up a dirt road to talk business with a widow who was sitting on her porch counting seeds," he said. "And she looked up at me with those clear eyes and the bowl of seeds in her lap. And she told me no with such complete self-possession that I rode home thinking about her for 3 days straight." Mary laughed, which felt good and true and unself-conscious in a way that laughter had not felt for a long time. "I thought about you too," she admitted. "Did you?" he said, and the smile that changed his face came back. "You came and made a business proposition and then stayed for coffee and talked to me like a human person," she said. It had been a while since someone had done that. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way while the last light left the sky and the stars came out, and it was the simplest and most complete thing she had felt in 11 months. September brought the fall cattle drive preparations, which for the Double S was a major operation involving weeks of planning and the coordination of nearly 30 men for the drive north to the railhead at Abilene. Theodore was occupied with this in the way he was occupied with everything, thoroughly and without complaint, and Mary watched him work from a closer distance now, and admired the way he managed the complexity of it. She went with him on a Saturday morning to inspect the herd before the drive, riding out to the far pastures on a good bay mare he kept for visitors. She had not ridden much since Daniel died, but it came back to her the way good things tend to, naturally and with pleasure. She rode alongside Theodore through the tall September grass, and they talked about cattle and about the drive, and about the price of beef at Abilene, which was respectable this year, and about the hands, some of whom she had come to know from her time at the Double. There was a young hand named Miguel who was 19, and from a family in Laredo, and who was on his first major drive. There was an older man named Ben Cooper, who had been with the Double S for 12 years, and who treated Theodore with a combination of loyal deference and friendly irreverence that suggested a relationship of genuine mutual respect. There was a woman named Dolers who kept the books and managed the supply orders, and who had arrived 2 years ago under circumstances that Theodore explained matter-of-factly and without embarrassment. She had been working at a hotel in San Antonio under conditions that were, to put it plainly, exploitative, and a former hand of Theodore's had mentioned she was good with numbers, and Theodore had hired her at fair wages and given her a proper position. Mary liked Dolers immediately, and they spent an afternoon together going over the supply inventory and talking with the comfortable directness of two women who understood the value of practical competence. The night before the drive began, Theodore and Mary sat on the porch of the Double S in the warm September dark, and he held her hand and was quieter than usual. "Come back," she said. "I always come back," he said. "I know," she said, "but I am saying it anyway." He turned to look at her, and in the light from the lantern his face was very serious and very open, and he said, "Mary, when I come back from this drive, I would like to ask you a question. A different question than the one I came to ask the first time." She understood what he meant. "I will be here," she said. He was gone for 6 weeks, and the 6 weeks were different from all the months before. Before, she had been alone on the farm in the way of someone adjusting to a new reality. Now she was alone on the farm in the way of someone who has something to wait for, which is a different kind of aloneness entirely. She planted the fall garden and put up the last of the summer preserves and repaired the south fence that had come loose again, and she thought about Theodore most of the day and some of the night, and she was not sorry about it. Edna came by and they had dinner together, and Mary told Edna everything, because Edna was going to figure it out anyway, and Mary would rather tell it than have it figured out, and also because there was real friendship between them that deserved honesty. Edna cried a little, which she apologized for, and Mary told her not to apologize. "Daniel would be glad for you," Edna said. "I knew Daniel Rhodes. He was a man who wanted you to be happy." "I know he was," Mary said. She wrote 2 letters to her sister in Missouri during those 6 weeks. Real letters that said real things rather than the carefully composed bulletins she had been sending since Daniel's death. Her sister wrote back with such evident joy and relief that Mary had to read the letter twice. Theodore came back from the drive on a Tuesday morning in October, road-worn and trail-dusty, and with the particular tiredness of a man who has pushed hard for 6 weeks. But his eyes were bright when he rode up to her farm and saw her come out onto the porch. He swung down from the black stallion and tied the horse and walked up the path, and she came down the porch steps to meet him, and he held out both his hands and she took them. "You are back," she said. "I told you I would come back," he said. They stood in the morning light in the yard, holding hands, and the October air was cool, and the peach trees Daniel had planted were bare now, their leaves gone, but the trunks were strong, and next spring they would bloom. Mary thought about that. "You said you had a question," she said. "I do," he said. He looked at her with those river water eyes, steady and open, and without any of the armor that men sometimes wore in these moments. "Mary Rhodes, I am 41 years old, and I have spent more of my life than I should have keeping my own company because I was not brave enough to look for what was missing. You are the most extraordinary person I have met in my life. You are strong and honest and kind and capable, and you make me want to be a better version of myself simply by being near you. I love you, and I would like very much to marry you, if you would have me." Mary felt the world go very still and very clear. She thought about seeds in dark earth. She thought about peach trees that bloom after the winter. She thought about river water eyes and firewood and coffee and late evenings on a porch where the conversation never ran out. She thought about planting things with faith and patience and trust in the process. "Theodore Sullivan," she said, "I love you too, and yes, I will marry you." He pulled her forward and held her, and she felt the solid warmth of him and the way he exhaled slowly, like something released. And she thought that this was what it felt like to be home in a place you had chosen rather than merely arrived at. They were married in the Harlow Creek Methodist Church on the 15th of November, 1878, on a cool, bright day with the sky that particular shade of cloudless blue. The church held about 40 people, and all 40 were there. And the minister was a kind man named Reverend Amos, who had known Daniel Rhodes, and who performed the ceremony with a gravity and a gentleness that honored what had come before without diminishing what was happening now. Edna Holloway sat in the front row and cried throughout the entire ceremony and made no apologies for it whatsoever. Ben Cooper, who had ridden in from the Double S with 3 of the other hands, stood in the back with his hat against his chest and the expression of a man who was moved but was working hard not to show it. Dolores stood with Rosa from the kitchen, and they both looked extremely pleased. Miguel, who was young and romantic by temperament, looked as though this was the finest thing he had ever witnessed. Mary wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, a practical and beautiful dress that was exactly right for a Texas November. She had put her dark hair up with pearl-tipped pins that had been her mother's. She walked up the aisle alone by choice, because she had walked a great deal of things alone in the past year, and she was not ashamed of it. Theodore stood at the front of the church in a dark suit and looked at her coming toward him with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not composed or careful or managed. It was simply wonder. They said their vows in steady, clear voices, looking at each other, and when Reverend Amos pronounced them married, Theodore kissed her with a tenderness that made Edna Holloway cry harder and made Ben Cooper give up any pretense of composure entirely. The reception was at the Double S, which Rosa had turned magnificent with flowers and food, and the evening was full of music from a fiddle player named Cal who could make that instrument do nearly anything, and dancing in the yard under lanterns strung between the posts, and laughter, and the kind of warmth that comes from people who are genuinely glad for 2 people they care about. Mary danced with Theodore until her feet ached, and she danced with Ben Cooper, who was an unexpectedly graceful partner, and she danced with Miguel, who was enthusiastic if not technically accomplished, and she danced with Edna Holloway, who was excellent. Theodore danced with Dolores and with Rosa and with Edna, and he held Mary's hand when they were not dancing, and looked at her with the expression that she was coming to understand, meant he was simply happy. When the guests had gone and the lanterns had been taken down and the evening had settled into the deep quiet of a Texas November night, Mary and Theodore sat on the porch of the Double S, which was now her porch too, in the dark and the stars, and she leaned against him and he held her close, and they did not need to say much of anything. "We should keep your farm," he said eventually. "I mean, as part of the Double S, but your farm. Keep it as your garden, your space. We can hire someone to manage the cattle side and you can do what you want with the land." "I would like that," she said. "And the peach trees," he said. "I want you to know I intend to see those peach trees bloom." She felt the warmth of that move through her, the understanding of what he was saying, which was not merely about fruit trees. "They will bloom next spring," she said. "Daniel planted them right, they just needed time." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "We have time," he said. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was mild by Texas standards, which was a mercy and a pleasure. Mary settled into the Double S with the same practical, purposeful approach she brought to everything, learning the larger operation, working with Dolores on the books, improving the kitchen garden through the winter months with the planning and preparation that would make the spring planting extraordinary. She was not lost in the larger household. She expanded it, shaped it, made it genuinely shared in a way that it had clearly not been before. Theodore watched her do all of this with a pride and a pleasure that he made no effort to conceal. He had been alone in this house for years, managing it as a productive space rather than a home, and the transformation was remarkable to him. Not because Mary had changed the furniture or the curtains, though she had done both, in subtle ways that improved things, but because the house felt inhabited now in the fullest sense. There were seeds on the windowsill drying for the spring garden. There were books on the table in the parlor where there had been only account books before. There was the sound of her in the mornings, moving through the kitchen with purpose and song, and that sound was worth everything. They argued, as married people do. They argued about the management of the South pastures where Mary had strong opinions based on what she had seen from her farm, and she was right, which Theodore acknowledged without excessive difficulty. They argued about the level of hospitality Theodore offered to every person who came by the ranch on any pretext, because Mary thought some of these people were taking advantage and Theodore thought she was being uncharitable, and she was eventually proven right about two of them, which she did not belabor. They had one serious argument about money, about the proper approach to a new contract with a buyer in Fort Worth, where Theodore was used to making decisions alone, and Mary had looked at the contract and found a clause that concerned her. She pointed it out in terms that were direct and specific, and he listened and took it seriously, and they rewrote the clause together. And afterward he said that he had been doing business alone for too long, and that it had made him careless in some ways he had not noticed. These arguments resolved into something better than what had come before them, which is what good arguments do. In February of 1879, Mary began to suspect what she confirmed by March, and she told Theodore on a Sunday morning while they were having breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him across the table with calm, clear eyes. "We are going to have a child," she said. Theodore set down his own cup very carefully. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that she felt slightly anxious, and then his face did something she had never seen it do before. Every bit of the careful steadiness he maintained came apart, just for a moment, and underneath it was joy so complete and unguarded that it almost hurt to see. "Mary," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and took her face in both hands and looked at her with those river-water eyes that were bright now in a way she had not seen, and he said, "I am so happy." "I am too," she said. "I thought you should know I am also frightened." "Tell me everything you are feeling," he said, "and I will listen." She told him because that was the kind of marriage they had, the kind where both people actually talked, and he listened the way he always did, fully and without interruption, and then he told her that he was there for all of it, and that she did not have to manage any part of this alone, and she believed him entirely because he had never told her anything he did not mean. Edna Holloway, upon being told in April, wept with immediate and complete conviction, and then recovered herself and said with great practicality that she had delivered 4 babies in this county, and she would be there when the time came. Mary said that she would be grateful for it. The spring arrived in Calhoun County with the usual extravagance, the bluebonnets pushing up along the fence lines and the creek running high and cold with the winter runoff, and the air smelling of warm earth and possibility. Mary planted the kitchen garden at the Double S with the thoroughness and love she brought to all growing things, Cherokee purples and Kentucky wonders and the squash and the beans and the herbs, and she expanded it by 1/3 from the previous year. She went to her own farm twice a week and tended the garden there too, where a man named Jonas, who Theodore had hired at full wages with Mary's input on the salary, managed the cattle operation with competence and reliability. The peach trees bloomed. She was in the garden at her old farm on a Wednesday morning in the first week of April when she looked up and saw the 2 young trees, barely taller than the fence, covered in pink blossoms. The blossom was early, encouraged by the mild winter, and the trees had come through it stronger than expected. She stood in the garden with her hand on her rounded belly and looked at the blossoms, pink and fierce and brief, the way blossoms always are, and she let herself feel everything at once, the grief and the gratitude and the love in all its forms, for Daniel who had planted them, and for Theodore who had promised to see them bloom and was home right now at the double S writing letters with the window open. She picked one small blossom carefully and put it in her pocket and walked home. She showed it to Theodore when she got back, setting it on his letter paper. He looked at it and then at her. "The peaches are blooming," she said. "Good," he said, and he reached for her hand. The baby was born in August of 1879, attended by Edna Holloway and Dr. Cummings, the same doctor who had stood in the corner the day Daniel died, and who had always felt some private guilt about that, and who was clearly relieved to be present at something that ended entirely differently. The birth was difficult and long and exactly as frightening as Mary had known it would be, and Theodore sat outside the bedroom door for 8 hours and did not move except when Ben Cooper brought him coffee, which he drank without tasting. When Edna Holloway opened the door with the expression of a woman delivering tremendous news, Theodore Sullivan, who ran 12,000 acres and was the wealthiest man in Calhoun County, and who had never in his adult life shown his feelings without careful intention, was on his feet immediately with his eyes bright and his composure entirely gone. "A son," Edna said. "A healthy, fine, enormous son, and your wife is well." Theodore put his hand over his eyes for a moment, and Ben Cooper, who was standing behind him, put a hand on his shoulder. The baby was large and loud and spectacularly healthy, with dark hair and eyes that were undecided about their final color. They named him Daniel Theodore Sullivan, Daniel for the man who had loved this land before either of them, Theodore for his father. It was Mary who suggested it and Theodore who received the suggestion with a silence that went on long enough that she worried she had misjudged, and then he said yes, quietly and completely, and she understood that he was saying something larger than yes. Little Daniel, who was called Danny by everyone within approximately 2 weeks of his arrival, was a child of vigorous opinions and substantial energy, who made himself known throughout the double S with great enthusiasm from his earliest mobile days. He had Theodore's eyes and Mary's determination, and a personality that seemed to be entirely his own, loud and curious and generous with his affections. Theodore, who had spent 17 years building a ranch and had not known what he was building it for, discovered within approximately the first hour of fatherhood that he had in fact been building it for this, for the specific and absolute pleasure of holding a small person who was part of him and part of the woman he loved and who was entirely new to the world. He was not a man given to excess emotion, but Danny overrode all of that. He read to the child and carried him through the pastures and showed him cattle at an age when Danny was most interested in putting everything in his mouth and falling down. Mary watched Theodore with their son and felt the love she had for him expand in a way she had not thought possible, spreading into the new shape of their family, the way water fills the space it is given. In the autumn of 1880, Mary was planting seeds again, her second October on the double S, with Danny sitting in the dirt beside her eating a peach from the young trees on the old farm, which had produced their first small harvest that summer, a dozen fruits that Mary had made into the finest preserves she had ever put up. Theodore was mending the far fence with Ben Cooper, and the sounds of their work carried across the afternoon air, the ring of tools and the occasional voice. Edna Holloway was sitting in a chair on the kitchen garden path, refusing to help with anything but offering extensive commentary, which was her contribution to most undertakings. Dolers had come out from the house to ask Mary something about the November supply order, and stayed because the afternoon was beautiful. It was an ordinary afternoon in every way except that it was not ordinary at all. It was the ordinary afternoon of a life that was working, of people going about good work in good company on good land, and Mary knew, with the clarity that comes to people who have lost things and found things again, that this was the thing worth having. Not the absence of difficulty or loss, not the perfect untroubled road, but this, the work and the company and the love that held all of it together. She put a tomato seed in the dark earth and pressed it down and covered it, and Danny reached over with his peach-sticky hand and patted the soil with great solemnity, as though he understood that something important had just been done. "Good," Mary told him. He beamed at her with the generous and uncomplicated happiness of a very young person who has no reason to think the world is anything other than excellent. Theodore came across the garden a little later, having left the fence with Ben Cooper, and he crouched down beside Mary and Danny in the afternoon light, big and solid and warm, and Danny immediately reached for his father with both arms, and Theodore lifted him with the practiced ease of a man who had become very good at this particular thing. Danny settled against his shoulder, and Theodore looked at Mary across the child between them. "How is the planting going?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "I have high hopes for next summer." "You always have high hopes," he said, with the smile that had changed his face the first time she saw it and had never stopped changing it. "That is why everything grows," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her, briefly and warmly, and Danny, who was at the age where he found his parents kissing extremely interesting and possibly something to comment on at length, said something enthusiastic and incomprehensible that made Edna Holloway laugh from her chair on the path. Winter came and softened and came again, and the seasons turned as they do with the reliable indifference to human emotion that makes them both a comfort and a challenge. And Mary and Theodore Sullivan built their years the way they had built everything between them, with honesty and attention and the willingness to do the work. They had a second child in 1882, a daughter they named Mary Rhodes, who arrived with less drama than her brother and immediately demonstrated that she was going to be quieter than Danny and considerably more perceptive, watching everything from the beginning with eyes that missed nothing. Clara had Mary's dark hair and Theodore's steadiness, and she and Danny, despite every difference in temperament, were devoted to each other with a completeness that made their parents look at each other over the children's heads with the private wordless conversation of people who have learned to speak without talking. Mary's farm continued to thrive under Jonas's management, and she kept her garden there in addition to the one at the Double S, and she thought of it often as Daniel's farm, not with grief anymore, but with a gratitude that had been refined by time into something clear and sustaining. She kept the peach trees. She kept the garden beds. She kept the careful records in Daniel's hand that she had found in the desk drawer, the notes about soil and weather and what had worked and what had not, and she added her own notes to them, different handwriting in the same book, continuing the record. In 1883, Theodore and Mary built a new section onto the house, not because the Double S was too small, but because life had filled the space and needed more, a proper schoolroom for the children and a larger garden shed, and a room for dolers that was better than what she had, because Mary had asked about it and learned that better was possible and made it happen. Small acts of justice, practical and private, the kind that do not make the newspaper but change the texture of a life. Ben Cooper, who was getting older now, was given a lighter set of responsibilities that he accepted with the dignified resistance of a man who would rather work too hard than be seen as diminished. And Theodore managed this negotiation with the patience and tact of someone who understood exactly what was required. Miguel, the young hand from Laredo who had been 19 when Mary first met him, had grown into a reliable and respected member of the operation, and in 1884 he came to Theodore with some ceremony to ask for his blessing before he proposed marriage to a woman in town, a schoolteacher named Lucia. Theodore gave it with evident pleasure, and Mary invited them both to dinner the following Sunday, and felt the warmth of a household that had become genuinely wide, that had room for the people in it to bring their lives. On a morning in the late spring of 1884, 5.5 years after she had sat on her porch counting seeds, and looked up to see a man on a black horse coming down the dirt road. Mary Rhodes Sullivan stood at the edge of her kitchen garden at the Double S and looked at what the season had done. The Cherokee purples were climbing. The Kentucky wonders were already reaching for the fence posts. The squash was spreading with its usual enthusiastic and slightly aggressive intention. The herbs were full and fragrant in the morning warmth. Danny, who was 4.5 now and deeply interested in everything, was crouching at the edge of the bed and watching a beetle with the focused attention of a small scientist. Clara, 2 years old, was sitting in the garden path looking at her own hands with an expression that suggested she was working on a problem. Theodore was somewhere in the barn with Ben Cooper, and she could hear the distant sound of his voice and Ben's response, the easy back and forth of a long working friendship. The morning was ordinary in all the best ways. Mary picked up a handful of earth and held it in her palm, the good dark soil that had been tended and fed and trusted over years, and felt its weight and warmth. She thought about all the things that grew in the dark before they came into the light. She thought about what it took to stay in the ground long enough to become something. She thought about patience and faith and the stubborn insistence of living things on continuing. She put the soil back and wiped her hand on her apron and went to her son and crouched beside him to look at the beetle together, and Danny told her its name, which he had made up himself and which was complex and specific, and suggested a rich interior nomenclature, and she agreed that it was an excellent name. Theodore came around the corner of the barn and saw them, and he stopped for a moment the way he sometimes did, just stopped and looked, as though he was taking something in. She looked up and met his eyes across the garden, and he smiled, the smile that had always changed his face, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like the first heat of the Texas summer, like the first day when the garden understands it is truly spring. She had come out to the porch with her bowl of seeds. A man had stepped off a black horse and said he had something to propose. She had said no to what he asked, and yes to what neither of them had expected, and the years between that morning and this one were the fullest years of her life, marked by grief transmuted into purpose, and purpose grown into love, and love expanding outward in every direction like good roots in good soil. Everything she had planted had grown. She stood up and waved at Theodore, and he came across the garden path toward her, and the children turned at the sound of their father's boots on the path, and Danny yelled something enthusiastic and Clara lifted her arms, and the morning was full of the sound of all of them together, and the bluebonnets were out along the fence line, purple and bright and growing in the cracked red earth the way they always had, because that is what they do. They do not wait for easier ground. They simply grow.